Richard left Mancos on September 12th, accompanied by his friend Harry French, who had come to Mancos from Chicago in 1887. During the time they remained at the fair, they stayed at the home of French's parents. The first few days were a kaleidoscopic tangle of impressions for Richard, who had not been so far east since his childhood, and never before in a city as large as this. Several times after leaving the fairgrounds, he went into the city with Harry French, who still knew his way about, to gaze and wonder at the sights. Lake Michigan's blue expanse, which he tried to compare with the mountain lakes at home, appealed to him more than the tall buildings rising from the business district. Lights at night, the swirling crowds of people and the noise, the confusion and smells of a big town were an exciting experience. But the baffling network of streets running almost endlessly in all directions made him uneasy and nervous. He confessed to French that he knew if left on his own he'd be lost in 10 minutes. Very quickly the city's novelty wore off, and he was content to spend the rest of his time between the fairgrounds and the home of his friend's parents. The fair attracted thousands of people from all corners of the country. This was truly a cross-section of America, Richard thought, not realizing that among the jostling swarm of people he stood out as a type. In Denver, he had bought a suit of conservative cut. In spite of this and a white shirt and well-brushed shoes, no one could have mistaken him for other than what he was. Leathery skin with wrinkles set deep around his eyes, a level, dark gaze, and a fierce brush of a mustache, his walk all revealed him as a Westerner, much more at ease in his saddle than on hard asphalt. At the fair, all of Richard's interest was centered on the anthropological building. Professor Ward Putnam, director of the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, was in charge of the displays. The huge ground floor was devoted almost exclusively to archaeology and ethnology, some 150 exhibits in all, including the collection from Mesa, Verde, and Grand Gulch. Exhibitors, for the most part, were ethnologists. Such men as W.H. Holmes of the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, Ernest Volk of Oberlin College, and George A. Dorsey of the Field Columbian Museum in Chicago. The response of the fairgoers pleased Richard enormously. They were curious, and he enjoyed answering their questions. Mummies of the Anasazi, shown here, as they had been found in their burial garments and pottery grave offerings, attracted the greatest curiosity. The Anasazi, Richard explained gravely, were among the earliest men to inhabit North America about whom anything was known. Natural elements alone had preserved the Anasazi mummies, those shriveled, leather-hued human beings whose bodies and whose yucca fiber sandals and feather cloth robes had defied the decay of centuries by virtue of dry chemistry of burial in the sand of caves where moisture never penetrated. In their country, his country, the air itself dried and embalmed the dead. And who were the Anasazi? Anasazi, said Richard, was a Navajo word. The Navajo used to describe the ancient people now vanished, whose ruined dwellings the Navajo found when they migrated into the Four Corners region from the northward. In a loose, vague sense, Anasazi meant ancient enemies. Richard did not know if this implied that the first of the Navajos had found some of the early ones still in their pueblos and cliff dwellings and made war upon them. As to the age of the Anasazi civilization, Richard could not say. He could only explain the cliff dwellings in the Pueblos had been built and finally abandoned before the Spaniards arrived in the 1500s. Of this he was sure, because no white man's implement had been found among the ruins. Sometime during the few weeks he spent at the fair, Richard, for the second time, met two young men whose interest in him and in his work was to determine the remaining years of his life. Talbot Hyde and Fred Hyde, Jr., sons of a New York physician and heir to the Babbitt Soap Company fortune, founded by their grandfather. The first meeting probably occurred earlier that summer at Alamo Ranch. From these meetings grew the Hyde exploring expeditions, so named by Richard, and an agreement that Richard would lead an expedition into Grand Gulch during the coming winter. Thus was initiated a chain of events, often misunderstood, widely criticized, and ending eventually in Richard's death. Out of their association, however, came pioneering, which may be called the cornerstone of Southwestern archaeology. At the time of his meeting with Richard in Chicago, Fred Hyde was 18 years old, a slender 6-footer, strikingly handsome, and almost painfully reserved. His brother Talbot was 2 years older, equally tall but heavier, with an open, friendly manner. Both of the young men regularly received large allowances, and in a few years would inherit small fortunes from their grandfather's estate. Benjamin Babbitt, the grandfather, was son of a Glens Falls, New York blacksmith who, after an apprenticeship at his father's forge, came to the city with a new idea and formula for making soap. Within very few years, Babbitt's name was a household word, and Babbitt was a millionaire. In the course of his rise to success, he married a young woman who had been described by a member of the family as unbending in her own formula for success in the small world of New York society. Their home was severely correct, a townhouse on 36th Street in a then fashionable district near Lexington Avenue. When their daughter, Ida Josephine, married Frederick E. Hyde, young physician, just beginning his career, Mrs. Babbitt took the couple firmly in hand. It was understood the doctor and Ida would not set up housekeeping on their own, but would live with the Babbitts. Further, it was agreed, in return for a generous allowance, young Dr. Hyde would confine his practice to families of good social standing and thus avoid bringing the diseases of common people into the Babbitt home. Nothing very much was heard from the doctor after that, except in time he and Ida Josephine became the parents of 2 sons, Benjamin Talbot Babbitt Hyde and Frederick Erastus Hyde, Jr. Neither was distinguished as a student, although Fred was said to have displayed splashes of brilliance at Harvard, where he attended classes more or less regularly for 4 years, but never graduated. Even at college, Fred remembered his father's early warning that women were dangerous, predatory creatures to be treated always with cold reserve. And sex, that was impressed on the boy, was impure weakness, animal-like in all of its manifestations, to be condoned only occasionally and then in the married state. These ideas haunted the youngster. At college, in what was almost frantic rebellion, he periodically disappeared from his classes for days at a time, returning unappeased, nervous, and convinced he was a monstrous, unnatural sinner.
And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.